Hello everyone, happy Friday and welcome to today's webinar, 7 Steps to Creating Audience-Driven Content and Demand Gen Nirvana. This is the final presentation in our inaugural Buyer Insights and Intelligence series. I'm Claudia Tirico, Features Editor at Demand Gen Report, and I'll be your moderator for this presentation. I encourage all attendees to get social with us during and after today's presentation. Please follow along and share your thoughts and feedback using the hashtag BII17. You can also connect with us using the @DG_report Twitter account or reach out to me directly. My Twitter handle is @Claudia Tirico, and our presenters are reachable at the hashtags listed here. Please feel free to share any questions or thoughts you have throughout the presentation. We're also hosting a special sweepstakes throughout the week-long series where attendees can win a free ticket to our annual B2B Marketing Exchange in sunny Scottsdale, Arizona, which will take place in February of 2018. If you registered for one BII webinar, you are automatically entered for a chance to win, and if you're attending our session live right now, you have received a second entry. We will be announcing winners each day of the series, so stay tuned. You who may be new to Demand Gen Report, here's a quick overview. We are an online media company publishing daily news, a weekly email newsletter, special reports, original research, and a rich menu of additional resources. If you haven't done so already, join more than 45,000 subscribers to our weekly newsletter by subscribing to Demand Gen Report today. Today's presentation, we're using the On24 platform. During the presentation, you can access all the information you need from the platform toolbar. We encourage you to ask our presenters questions, and to do so, simply click the Q&A widget at the top right corner of the screen. Today's presentation is slated to run about 25 to 30 minutes, with 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A following the presentation. You can submit your questions using this Q&A widget at any time. Today's session is also being recorded, and all attendees will receive an archived link to the presentation to go back and review or share with colleagues. In addition to joining the conversation online and submitting your questions, we also welcome and encourage you to participate by letting us know how we're doing. In an effort to constantly improve the level of value we provide to our audience members, we put together a very brief survey that will automatically launch once this webinar session ends. You can pull up, complete, and submit the survey at any time during this webinar by clicking on the survey icon in the taskbar on the bottom of your screen. You can see the survey icon circled here on the bottom of the slide right now. Before signing off today, please take a moment to complete this quick questionnaire, and doing so will just help us, better serve you. Pleased to introduce our featured speakers for today, Jessica Lavery and Steve Voice. Jessica is the Senior Manager of Content and Corporate Communications at Veracode, an application security solutions and services provider. In this role, she leads the Veracode Corporate Communications function, which consists of public relations, branding, social media management, and content marketing. Jessica's involvement within marketing for the security industry goes back more than a decade at companies like Astaro and Sophos, where she held roles in corporate communication and marketing. Here's a fun fact about Jessica. She rides horses and plays the trumpet, but not at the same time. Steve Voice is the Director of Demand Generation for Content for Demand, a B2B firm specializing in e-media and custom content solutions. In addition to managing the content for demand marketing and demand generation strategy, Steve consults with B2B brands across all industries to enhance their content marketing programs. Steve's extensive background in B2B marketing and enthusiasm for storytelling serve him well in designing strategies that connect with customers. When he's not brainstorming campaigns, Steve is likely cooking, eating, and/or dreaming about macaroni and cheese. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you, Steve. Take it away.
Thanks for the great introduction, Claudia. I'm really excited to be here as a part of the Buyer Insights and Intelligence series. And I'm actually really excited to be here with Jessica Lavery, one of our fantastic clients. She's a great speaker and was gracious enough to join us for today's webinar. So just as Claudia said, Content for Demand, just to give you context for who we are and sort of the role that we're going to be having in this webinar, Content for Demand is a B2B content creation agency as well as content strategy development. So that's interactive and static formats as well as personas, buyer messaging exercises, and strategic campaign development. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Jessica Lavery from Veracode.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate having me on this webinar. So I work for a company called Veracode. What we do is we find the vulnerabilities in software that hackers use to breach companies. So what we do is actually very pertinent to the presentation I'm going to be giving today, and I wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Fantastic. So now that you've got context for who Jessica and I are and the roles that we have for our company, we'll just jump right in. And before we get to the 7 steps to manage Nirvana, a wonderful title that Jessica helped us brainstorm, I thought we'd just touch on briefly sort of what is audience-centered content and why does it matter, especially as we tell you how to go about standing up buyer-focused content and strategies. I think it makes sense to hone in more on why it matters. And again, this has been an issue and a trend I think that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years of marketers navigating more towards putting their buyers at the center of their content and really prioritizing those insights and pulling them into the marketing to make it more effective. That's a big of the crux of what we're going to talk about today. And I'm certain that there's a more official definition out there, but here at Content for Demand, we kind of rope it into these certain buckets. So it's content that keeps in mind things like the buyer's role in the organization, or the role that they have in the purchase decision, where they are in their buying process, where their watering holes are, what their pain points are. But the big key thing is that, again, it's prioritizing all of that information that you as the marketer hold and making it into the content, pulling it in and making sure that it's relevant, and more importantly, that it converts. This is an image that probably a lot of you have seen. This is actually from the Serious Decisions messaging Nautilus. But if you're a visual learner like me, I think it'll help crystallize a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. And I think it does a really nice job of explaining how our personas, our audience, goes through and engages with us. Because we really know that they're going through a buyer's journey. And whether you use the 6-stage process that Serious Decision outlines or maybe a more simplified one, this is a really good framework to use as a jumping off point. But again, I really like how it illustrates that, again, we're talking to audiences, buyers at the end of the day. They're people, and they have specific needs and value propositions that need to be addressed and honed in on in our content and our messaging that we're sending out to them at the different stages. And more importantly, that, again, we know that the messaging is not generic and that it varies by stage and by persona. So again, I think this is a really nice job of sort of level setting of when we say buyer-focused messaging, this is what we're talking about. And I think these are all insights from Demand Gen Report's content preferences survey that they recently released. Really good survey report if you haven't accessed it before. But I really like what this slide illustrates here because in the last few years, you've seen a lot of conversation about the over-inundation of content. And really what these stats showcase for us is that content is actually playing more and more of an important role. Here you can see that 97% of respondents in the survey are saying that they're going to either engage with more or about the same level of content as they did last year. So again, if you're going to be creating content and you want it to achieve your marketing goals, it's got to be buyer-focused to make sure that it converts and it resonates with your audience. And the next slide here, this is really about, the reality is that we're consuming content, but not all content is created equally. And this is where you can really see the prescriptive nature to which, B2B buyers are telling us what they want out of our content. They want us to do things like curb the sales message, add more third-party perspectives. Again, these are things that help make it more buyer-friendly and speak more to them as people, as buyers, and less as, us peddling our information, our services, et cetera. A few things that we need to keep in mind as we're developing content and buyer-focused messaging. We need to consider the context of the message that they need to hear. So this is an interesting slide, and takeaway for me is that there's different types of messaging out there, be it prescriptive, benchmarking, and I think one of worthwhile exercise that a lot of us marketers should take on is understanding these different types of messaging, where it works best for our different personas, and how these different messaging frameworks or styles resonate with our audience across the different buyer stages. Another key thing is considering the content format. So, there's different format types that our buyers like to engage with, again, across the different stages. So this is just a really good snapshot of some of the more popular ones as measured by Demand Gen Report. So you can see some tried and true versions on here, case studies, white papers, webinars. I think the key thing here to take away is that, we need to understand, what this looks like for each of our individual audiences. Because while this is good benchmark data jumping off point for us, I would say that each of our audiences, depending on the industry, the type of buyer, would have specific preferences, for their preferred formats, and again, variations by stage. And then finally, this is an interesting slide to me because we talked about, again, why does this all matter? And this is, you can see some of what our peers in the B2B buying sector are saying, what are their, or really these are from actually other marketers, of what are their organization's demand gen priorities for the remainder of the year. And this is really interesting. It's, obviously focusing on lead quality and quantity, and then improving conversion rates. And again, if I could give any single piece of advice on how to improve these statistics that marketers are saying are so important, that's really delving into understanding your buyers, prioritizing those insights, and pulling them into the content and messaging campaigns that you're developing. So I just wanted to give a little bit of picks before we jumped in, again, more on the how, or the why, before we jumped into the how. And this is really where you're going to see Jessica kind of chiming in more, because she and Veracode have been on a journey over the last, several years to really get to Demand Gen, Nirvana, and I think some of the insights that she's going to share here are going to be really relevant for all of us to take away. So with that, I'll pass it to Jessica.
Thank you, Steve. Now, before I get into the how we did it or how our process works, I wanted to give a personal story of why personas are so important to content marketing. And this, again, comes from my personal life more so than my professional life. But I come from a very large family by anyone's standards. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of family gatherings. And so it was one of these family gatherings. We had, some aunts sitting over in one area and a bunch of cousins over another. And, we have little cliques around the family because we're that big. And one of my cousins inexplicably sat with my aunts. And he was college age and started talking about his previous weekend debauchery and, the crazy antics he and his friends went through, and kind of proudly about, how crazy they had gotten. And immediately after finishing his story, my aunts looked at him in stunned silence, and then all at once started going at him with, you're going to fail out of school, what are you, stupid, and all other sorts of put-downs. And what he didn't realize was, had he walked over to his group of similarly aged cousins, they probably would have been getting high fives and laughing, and then maybe someone retaliating with a story and trying to one-up him. But because he didn't realize who his audience was and who he was talking to at the time, he gave them the wrong content. And that's why it's so important to really understand who you're talking to when you create content. Now, as I mentioned before, Veracode is in the cybersecurity industry. And one area that makes us very lucky is that this is an industry with no shortage of stories that we can tell. There's constantly news articles around hacking, breaches, new vulnerabilities coming out in the news. The problem with that is, where do we focus? Because we sell to a very specific need in the cybersecurity space, a niche market towards developers as well as security professionals. So the same topic that would be interesting to someone purchasing antivirus software or identity access management software would not at all be interesting to the same buyer purchasing application security software. And that was a challenge that we were really faced with because we were just talking about security. We instinctively knew that we needed to have content. So we started creating stories based on what was popular in the news. Stories like the security of Internet of Things. These are the stories that you would hear in the news about children's dolls spying on the kids, or home garage door openers being hacked and opened by criminals, or the connected car story, which is a big topic nowadays as we're getting more into driverless cars. Can they be hacked? The problem is we don't secure that kind of software. So while we received a lot of downloads of these reports and quite a bit of press coverage, it's what we would call borrowed interest. It was tying ourselves to a story to get publicity that didn't actually help us in the end. So what we needed were topics that better tied us to what we did so that we could elevate our brand recognition, but also once we got the people to tie us to those stories in their mind and position us as talking about that issue, those people would be the right audience to also buy our solutions. Another thing we were doing that was hurting rather than helping is that we were gating everything. I mean, case studies, we were gating analyst reports to, data sheets, and our personas don't like gated content. To be fair, this was an overcorrection from the days when we gated absolutely nothing except for webinars. So we were trying to find that right balance. And the crux of the problem, when we really sat down and examined it, is that we had two sources of content. We had a demand generation team that was creating content that was very Veracode focused with the sole purpose of getting demand generation or getting leads. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we had a PR team that was creating content with the sole purpose of getting headlines. And those topics weren't crossing paths at any point. So what we needed was a coordinated content team that thought about both demand generation and our PR. And we created that team with the focus on both of these goals. And how did we start? Well, of course, we started with getting to know our personas and getting intimate with them. And once we really conducted the study and understood their two personas better, what we came to understand was they were really two sides of the same coin. We had the developers who were most concerned with developing software and the security professionals who were most concerned with securing that software by finding vulnerabilities. But they were both a very technical audience who understood the content that we were creating at a very deep level, and as a result had no tolerance for fluffy content or what they would consider marketing. So even though they had very similar backgrounds, their motivations ended up being very different. While developers, their goal was to get software out the door as fast as possible, and security job was to slow them down to make sure that they were securing that software and not putting out software that was vulnerable. So what we needed to do was create content journeys for each group that ultimately led them to the same place, you need application security, but started at a different point.
Perfect. Yeah, and Jessica really illustrates a great point there, but just the overall importance of understanding your buyers and documenting that in a buyer persona and going back to it even periodically. This is actually an output. This is not the Veracode persona as you might have guessed, but one that we developed for a different company and genericized. So as I mentioned, Content for Demand does create buyer personas, but really the point in showing this here is just to kind of illustrate some of the points that Jessica made and highlight some of the key areas that we have marketers focus on that are a part of the persona. A few of our favorite areas include their role in the buying journey, as well as their buyer pain points. These are really meaty areas where you can really get to the root of what their issues are and help move them to different stages. Another key area that I like to focus in on is the watering holes. So where are they going to get their information? This actually does really helpful when you're planning out your marketing campaigns in those key areas of where you're going to actually be posting your content and sharing it with them. Great. And then just wanted to highlight some quick buyer persona best practices. So a couple of things that we recommend that personas should be. The first is specific. So again, that's just a generic persona is certainly a worthwhile tool, but the more granular you can get and the more detailed nuances you can pull into your personas, those are going to be the really meaty bits that are going to help inform your marketing messaging and your marketing campaigns. We also make sure that you make these personas actionable. So it's great as a guiding tool, but making sure that you're sharing these personas across your departments, not just having them live on the marketing shelf, is key. I would say some important departments that you'd want to share them with outside of marketing would be sales and product. They should also probably be involved in the creation of the personas if they aren't already. And then the other thing as you're going about creating personas, I would recommend is just making sure that what you're including in there is testable. So the things that you want to be able to approve or disprove anything that you're putting into persona. So stay away from, again, generalities and things that couldn't be tested. And again, from a process perspective, just a few things to look out for. Make sure that you're avoiding out of context data or taking data out of context. It can be a detrimental thing. And again, I think that's why it's so key to interview your different stakeholders, both externally and internally, and highlight with which the context they shared the information that you're pulling into your persona. Another good thing in terms of a tip for creating personas is looking for those areas of contrast and comparison. I think a lot of the differences in the interviews you might conduct with your internal or external folks will really highlight some of the key areas where you're going to focus in on and highlight your persona. And then again, just keeping sight of, this probably relates back to the point of them being actionable. Make sure that when you're developing the persona, that you're keeping sight of those broader marketing and business objectives. What do you want to get out of having created a persona? Obviously, it should inform your marketing, but there are larger things like having it inform sales trainings, things like those that are, again, improve bottom line metrics that you'll want to keep in mind. And then, again, just make sure you're prioritizing and preserving those actionable insights, again, sharing them across departments.
With those personas, what we learned was that our developers and security audience, they were what we call, quote, allergic to marketing. So we needed to tell stories that informed the market that didn't try to sell our products. So we used that information to create what we call our messaging stack. For each persona, we came up with a series of 3 to 4 key themes we wanted to communicate to that persona. Each theme is supported by 3 or 4 stories that we want to tell relating to that theme. And then each story has a number of messages that we use to tell that story. And the best way to make that come to life is to use an example that is near and dear to our persona's hearts, the movie Star Wars. So Star Wars has an overarching theme of the light versus the dark, good versus evil. Each movie in itself is a story that tells, that supports that high-level theme. And then each movie has a series of messages that it gets across through dialogue and action. And all together, they come up to the top of the theme. No one piece of content tells the whole overarching theme that we create. And in some cases, with smaller content like blog posts or social media content, you're actually only telling one message of one story. But collectively, all together, they communicate that theme.
That's awesome. Anytime we can reference Star Wars in a webinar, it's a good day. So yeah, I think Jessica just shared a really great framework for overall messaging, and especially how it relates to stories and the individual themes. Wanted to also piggyback off that and share the way that Content for Demand looks at buyer messaging. So it kind of cascades to a couple different levels. So at the highest level, you've got your company or brand strategy and messaging, and that's a really key pillar that we recommend all companies have and establish. Because that everything from there will really cascade down in, and obviously, hopefully, we'll have a buyer focus in and of itself, the brand strategy. I'll skip a level and move down to the buyer persona message, because that's what we're going to talk about, in this section, and really what I think Jessica and Veracode have done a really nice job of establishing, understanding the messages that their individual buying groups need. Roll up a level, and you can actually tie in different segment level messaging. So this is however you at your organization will look at segments. That could be across industry verticals or even buying channels, but there's likely a grouping of messaging that's relevant to multiple versions of your personas. And rolling that up and having it ready at the segment level has also been key to success for a lot of our clients. And then finally there at the bottom, you've got your custom sales-based messaging. So this is, I mentioned earlier that it's important to customize and share your personas across departments. This is really where messaging, sometimes as marketers we tend to stop once we've got, our content message baked out, our campaign message baked out, and we don't often share what the message needs to be for the salespeople so they can talk to our campaigns in a smart way. And then just finally, along the left-hand side here, we've got the campaign level messaging. And here at Content for Demand, we tend to say that, really you can have a campaign message that's going to be unique at any one of these 4 levels, be it brand, segment, buyer persona, or sales insight. But kind of understanding this as a framework we thought would be useful for all of us here on the webinar. And then I also want to just share sort of what an output looks like if we're going to say, again, this is an example for a buyer persona messaging. And it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but just to give you a sense and crystallize it in your mind, there's sort of two different outputs that we typically deliver with a buying messaging exercise, and that's primary and secondary messaging that's again, specific and actionable for the persona and the titles that we're brainstorming on. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how this is actually, I would say, the more important of it, how that primary and secondary messaging is customized across the buyer's journey. So again, this could be just 3 stages if that's what your organization does. This one's mapped here to the Serious Decision Standard 6. And this one in particular is actually asked in the form of questions. So these are highlighting the questions that the audience needs answered at the individual level. One thing that we also pair with that is obviously the answers. And these are the key narrative elements that have to be baked in for it to be relevant for your buyers. So just an example there for you to review.
So our third step was mapping out our content going forward. Now that we understood our persona's needs and then using the messaging stack to drive our planning, we used the content themes to create our quarterly content maps for each persona. So each persona had its own map. And the idea is to have a content journey supporting one of the 4 themes through stories and messages. We'd anchor on a single piece of content in the center, which would be the convert content. And this is a heavier piece of content, some sort of guide or practical how-to document that both developers and security professionals would be willing to give up their valuable personal information in order to receive the document. Leading to that guide was a series of attract-level content. And because all of this is awareness-level content, it's all ungated. And that would be anything from a blog to a video to an ebook, and even what we call info sheets, which are like a data sheet, but more on a topic or an issue than on a specific product. And all of these pieces of attract and engage or awareness content pieces would have specific call to actions leading to the convert content. On the other side of the convert content, we had what we call the convince and close or exclusive content. This is content that can't be found on our website and isn't posted anywhere. It is given to our business development team to use when following up with leads who downloaded the convert content. Because we know that our personas are, again, allergic to marketing, they're also allergic to a sales guy calling them. They don't want to be called all the time. So instead of following up with, hey, you downloaded this report, are you interested in Veracode products? It's, hey, you downloaded this report, let me email you this follow-up that might be helpful to you. And the idea there is to warm them up to talking to Veracode later on about our products. It's a long journey. And to give you an example of what this content flow looks like, one content map started with an infographic around what a superhero software developer looks like today and all the tools and skills that developer needs. Piece of content had a call to action to read the Secure DevOps Survival Guide that Content for Demand helped us write. This told them how to deal with this new issue and this new way of developing software that's called development operations and how they can change their skills to fit in to this new paradigm. And then a follow-on to that, which was used by our business development representatives, was how Veracode helps to secure DevOps, because one of the skills they need is security. One of the things they need to do from the survival guide is understand how to add security and security testing into their process of DevOps, and now here's how we can help you.
Perfect. Next, I really like Jessica's framework. She and I have talked about this before, and it's just, I think, a fantastic model for all marketers to follow, and it really almost works as a de facto scoring model. I wanted to piggyback and just share one more example that actually of how you can use interactive content to fuel the same kind of approach of how you engage your audiences. So this is an example of an interactive assessment tool that we created for another one of our clients, Cox Media. This lived as an ungated asset, and you can see here from the screen grab that all the information at the onset was available without a gate. So there was the tool you could engage with. There was also an influencer ebook that went along to support the piece of content, as well as a video, all dedicated to educating their audience on the importance of sports marketing. Once users started engaging with the tool, that's where they started, again, the recommendation that was a part of the solution tool. And at that point, that's where they actually presented the gated information. So Cox Media was actually able to, again, use the tool to share information, stuff that they wanted their audience to understand without having to submit a form. And then only once they got them close to serving up the presentation of what that specific sports marketing opportunity looked like, that's where they gated the information, and that was the signal to the salesperson to say, oh, we have an interested lead who wants to learn more about advertising in the NFL. So I thought this was a really good example to show the audience and just kind of walk through, again, and illustrate the power of interactive content and how it relates back to great frameworks like Jessica's done at Veracode.
Thanks, Steve. And as I mentioned earlier, we were gating way too much of our content. I mean, 100% of our content had a gate in front of it. And this really turned off the developers and the security professionals who, by their nature, don't like to give away their personal information. It's something that privacy is something they believe in very strongly. So we fixed this by paying attention to what they were doing with ungated content. Once we got them in our nurture stream and they had downloaded a piece of content that was gated, how did they behave? And we found that solid, practical content, and that's what they were willing to click on the most. And we made the decision that that's what we would gate going forward. And that's how we structured our content maps because of it. We found that some of the fluffier content still worked for the awareness base as promotions or basically little advertisements for our convert content. But what we needed to do was make sure that we understand how they behaved before we could determine what could be gated.
Perfect. Yeah, no, and I think paying attention to buyer signals is a foundational and becoming a more and more important part of content marketing. So I wanted to showcase a few different areas that me as the director of marketing for the agency, things we actually do to kind of sharpen and make sure that we're paying attention to buyer signals. So one of the tools that we use is actually Uberflip, and their hub instance allows us to get a lot of different metrics on the back end of our ebooks. So I really like this because before, when my marketing leadership would ask me, oh, Steve, talk to me about how is this ebook that we just wrote performed? And I could say, well, I have this many downloads. Making our standard PDFs into interactive flipbooks has allowed me to get metrics and understand buyer signals in a way that I couldn't before. So you can see here on the screen just a few of those examples, things like unique visitors, unique views, downloads, or even average time spent on page, which is really helpful. This is another screen grab of, again, I think this is probably the most helpful of some of the data I couldn't get at before, where, again, it was just saying, well, I've seen it downloaded this many times, I got this many, leads generated from it. But I think understanding, even at a foundational level, of how far into the piece that they're scrolling. So you can see here, this kind of maps out for me, again, this is a 7-page asset. Viewership starts to dip down quite a bit when you reach pages 5 and 6. And from that, I can kind of customize and maybe enhance to say, okay, going forward, let's try to strive for maybe 4-page books, or even I can potentially optimize this existing piece of content and shorten it to the level that my buyers are telling me they want to engage with. Great. And then the final view that I like to look at for my different PDF ebooks and flipbooks and Uberflip are where folks are zooming in. This is really important information for me. You can see what the graph, there's sort of a heat map that comes with the tool that shows me where they're zooming in. And this is really helpful when I'm trying to brainstorm, okay, where are people most engaged? It breaks it down by page. And then on the individual page, you can see where the zooms are happening, which helps me brainstorm additional ideas for new content, maybe blog posts or supplementary pieces that might go along with the ebook. Another platform we use to kind of capture buyer signals is with the Ceros platform. So we actually have an agency license to this, and we create interactive experiences like the one you see here on the screen for some of our clients. The one that's being showcased here is actually an interactive infographic, and similar to Uberflip, it takes what could have been a static PDF and converts it into an engaging experience, where again I can get key buyer signals and share those with our clients. So again, time spent on page, average time spent by visitor. These are all really relevant and important buyer signals that we want to share with our clients and help them optimize their content. Big thing that I like with Ceros is that they can break down sort of the different device types with which the content's being engaged. So you can see here on the screen that desktop is a front runner for NASDAQ and their audience. So this is an important detail for them to know, that people are primarily looking on desktops, but you can see smartphone jumping up as a more and more relevant piece. And that, again, sends the buyer signal that you want to make sure you're having mobile-friendly and mobile-optimized content.
And then one thing that we knew from studying our personas was that promotion has a really ugly connotation with developers and security professionals. It feels like marketing. And so what they wanted was content that spoke to them and their needs but didn't feel like they were being sold to. But they also wanted it presented in a way that didn't feel like an ad. So what we started to do was create these social media images that had one stat or one quote that was interesting and compelling that would make someone say, I want to know more about that topic. We also started putting them on places where we knew our audiences gathered, for lack of a better word. And for us, that was mostly Twitter and other development forums like GitHub and Reddit. And we started giving some of our content away, even our gated content. On our landing pages, one of the things we're starting to do now is give a preview of the content before we ask for their information. So they can read maybe the first page. Much like when you go on to Amazon to buy a book, you can read maybe a couple of pages of the book and then decide if you want to buy it. And that way we're creating goodwill, but we're also showing them, hey, this is really worthwhile content for you to give us your valuable information. But it wasn't all wins for us, and we do have our strikeouts every once in a while, and this is a good example of one. We tried creating some memes because developers like memes, and they think they're funny. And we were lucky in that they didn't miss so far that it caused ridicule. They just didn't get any engagement. And what we learned was we're just not that funny. What we needed was a better developer perspective. And we took that information and said, all right, when we go to places like Reddit, where our developer audience already is discussing some of these issues, we need to be very careful and have an authentic conversation with them that does not have the goal of marketing or even bringing people back to our website. The goal is to talk about the issue and make the issue something that they see as important. And I'm glad we had this little miss here with the memes, because I don't know that we would have been as careful with our Reddit strategy had we just jumped right in.
Yeah, always got to be careful with your memes. No, I don't really have anything else to add to Jessica's well-taken point. I think it's important that we develop relevant messages across the board. So I thought I'd really just kind of round it out with highlighting one of my favorite Ann Hanley quotes. She's sort of a content marketing rock star for me. But I remember she taught me this lesson early on. I listened to one of her webinars, so I thought I'd reshare it with you guys. And that's that the content and messaging should really have three things to make sure that it's going to be relevant for your audience, and that's inspiration, empathy, and utility. And really, it's a summation game, so really a multiplication. So if any of those elements is zero, the entire base of the content nets out to zero. So just some fun facts to live by. I did this a lot in my early days as a content marketer, where I was actually highlighting the individual sections of my emails or my content that were inspiration, empathetic, or served a purpose. But still do it to a certain extent today. But definitely a worthwhile quote for this webinar.
Yeah, and Steve, in my piece, that you don't make somebody angry, laugh, or cry, you're probably not resonating with them. So I think that makes a lot of sense too. So this next section, the differentiate metrics and measures of success, can be a little controversial, because as marketers, we know that what we do is not just an art, but it's also a science. And at Veracode, we measure very carefully the funnel. And I'm sure a lot of other people out there, they take painstaking detail the way that the leads move throughout the funnel. I'm not talking about the actual marketing funnel. I'm talking about what I call invisible funnel. And that's really where you're talking about the awareness content. We know that the awareness content we put out there on places like Reddit and the conversations we're having on Twitter and the blog posts we're having out there have an impact on our marketing funnel. And we know that it creates a lot of awareness and traffic to our website. We can track that actually, where people come in through our blog and then click on links, but we can't track it very carefully, the impact the invisible funnel has on the marketing funnel. So we have to be really careful about saying, oh, that activity wasn't worthwhile, it didn't produce leads, or it didn't eventually hit the sales funnel, it didn't create an opportunity. What I say is that as we get into this world where more and more people, even in the business-to-business world, don't want to be marketed to, they want to be communicated with, and they're looking for conversations, we're going to have to be more comfortable with that little gap between the invisible funnel and the marketing funnel that we can't exactly put numbers on.
No, that's really important. I think a lot of us are struggling with that these days, and just on the different ways that we can measure and how it all comes together. And I wanted to share again some stats from, this is another survey report done by Demand Gen Report, and this is their marketing measurement and attribution survey. And again, it underscores the importance of measurement, and that 91% of marketers are ranking the ability to measure as a priority for their organization. The reality, though, is that a lot of companies, much like Jessica and myself, don't have it all figured out. This is for marketers. Only 48% of marketers are actively measuring campaign attribution and influence. And that's because it's a difficult thing. And I think we have to start being okay with that. A more important slide to share, because again, it also reinforces the point that Jessica made earlier about the pressure that we're all seeing from the top to focus more on measures of success or metrics that relate to business objectives like MQLs, leads generated, probably more importantly, pipeline and revenue influenced. And again, those are important. We can't lose sight of those. But again, to Jessica's earlier point about the invisible funnel, we can't stop paying attention to web traffic, total inquiries, things like that. It's really the full picture of a lot of the stats you see here on the screen that come together to gauge the real measure of success, and that independently, they're all just individual metrics. And then I thought I'd close out this portion by just kind of reinforcing again, this is sort of a summary findings from, you can see they're asking respondents to talk about where their priorities lie, and there's that high group of people that are saying they need to show marketing's impact on pipeline and revenue, and I would not dispute that. The thing that I thought was interesting and highlighted for you guys at the bottom is that there's now a lower emphasis being placed on getting actionable insights on buyer interest, and I think this is potentially dangerous to a lot of the marketers, foregoing this. Because again, if we're focused on generating pipeline and revenue, we know we still have to understand our buyers fundamentally. They're changing all the time. So, scaling back on some of those buyer insight exercises could be potentially bad for your content and for your marketing long-term goals.
Great. And for the first year of our content journey, when we first created our content team, we did what I think a lot of companies do, is we created our maps, we communicated out to the demand gen and public relations team, telling them what we're going to create, and then created it and handed it off and expected it to be used. And what we needed was a more collaborative approach to how we not only planned our content, but also released our content. So we looked to a really unlikely place for how to go toward this collaborative approach. And because we are a company that works with developers, and developers are moving to this DevOps culture, we thought, why don't we try a similar approach? So DevOps is a collaborative way of developing software. You plan with your operations team what you're going to produce, you produce it, and then you work with your operations team to have it deployed. So if we look at the marketing team the same way that we'd look at a development and operations team, the architecture team, or the ones who decide what is the overarching goal of a campaign, is our campaigns team. And we had a campaigns team for each persona. The development team, or our content team, would then develop the software/content that was to be used. And then the operations team would be our PR, social media, demand gen, the people responsible for nurture programs, and our business development representatives who follow up with leads once they download content. So each and every one of those people had a part to play in the development of our content. And this updated our planning process. So we'd start with what I called our DevOps meetings. And in our DevOps meetings, we'd structure them so that they were in 3-month intervals. During the 3rd month of the quarter, we talk about what content are we going to produce for the next quarter. Here's our content map, and here is the schedule of when content will be released. It's at this point when we ask all the other operations teams if they have all the information they need, any ideas for changes or date changes. So, for example, our PR person might say, hey, this particular blog post that you're putting out there would be a great contributed article. Can you not post it on August 1st and instead hold it while I pitch it out to the media? Or the nurture team might say, hey, we'd really love to use that blog post for this nurture email. Can you move it up a few days so that it can fit into our nurture stream timeline? So we'd iron out all those details there to make sure that the content would all be used. During the 2nd month, what we would talk about is, all right, this content is in the process of being created. What are the plans for how it's going to be used? How are we going to solidify that? And then in the, I'm sorry, that was in the 1st month. And then in the 2nd month, we do a retro. How was the content used and how did it perform? And as a result, we've seen a lot more website sessions, content downloads, and we're already 30% higher on our social media goals. And this is because we know the content is being used. We're no longer sending it out into the world and hoping it's successful. We know before we create it exactly how it's going to be used so we can format it and tailor that content to its use. And this has resulted in some early business results. For one of our seminal pieces of content, our State of Software Security Report, we've already, at the beginning of this year, seen about 1,000 leads come in. And just recently I asked about opportunity creation. We have at least 10 opportunities totaling in several $1 million worth of software sales. So by knowing how we're going to use the content and how it was going to be promoted, we're able to better serve our business.
Fantastic. No, I always love hearing the story from Jessica about the DevOps and really kind of taking the signals from their audience and informing their own strategy. But I know, so that was really all that Jessica and I wanted to share with you guys, and just wanted to, again, kind of recap with the different steps. They're there on the screen. It's a lot of information, but we hope that it has been helpful for you guys, and it'll inform your content and your demand gen strategies. You know, if we had to put sort of a pin on everything, the ultimate recommendation that I'd offer up is that really, continue to prioritize your buyer needs, your pain points, and to not just your content marketing, but really all aspects of your marketing. It's such a fundamental, best practice now that we take a sort of the buyer-focused lens on all that we do, and I think it really is the key to all success in marketing. So with that, we're also Jessica and I are also available for questions. We're going to do some Q&A now. But then I'd also encourage you to reach out to us individually if there's anything that you have questions on that you heard today.
Thank you, Jessica and Steve, for a fascinating presentation. It definitely sparked some great questions. But before I get to those, I'd like to remind everyone once again to please share your thoughts and feedback before logging off today. You can do so by clicking the survey icon, which you can see circled here on the bottom of your screen at any time. You can also wait for the close of the session, at which time the survey will automatically launch. Now let's get to those questions. All right, I have a good one here from Glenn. Okay, where are some of the best practices to gather the buyer insights that make up a solid persona?
Yeah, I can take this one. So we were lucky at Veracode in that one of our major personas was that developer audience, and we're also a software company, so we had a whole development team that we could source for information. The other one was the security audience, and we have a whole security research team that we could source for information. So we definitely looked a little bit internally on what is the typical persona. But then when we were at events, we would try to set up for us, it was events like RSA and Black Hat, which are big security and developer events. We'd try to set up focus groups where we'd ask about the type of information they want. And then finally, the third way is we just watched how our content performed and listened on forums and Twitter and other social media platforms to the criticisms that they so helpfully gave and very willingly and freely when content didn't resonate with them, and we tried to learn from that experience.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that was really, again, I think Jessica highlighted that some great audiences there to go after. Looking, interviewing your sales, marketing, and product teams is another great source of persona information. We find that a lot internal insights fuel a lot of personas and good exercises there. Customer interviews, whether the focus groups that Jessica mentioned, those are also a fantastic source. And then finally, if you can interview actually or survey even your prospects, that's another really good source of data. Along with CRM, there's got a little good information there for you to bake into your personas, and then also industry panels can oftentimes offer up great insights for you to pull from.
Great, thank you. Here's another great question. This one's from Jody. When developing content and campaigns, how do you balance staying buyer-focused, being really fun, creative, and being brand-friendly? Any tips or recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that no matter what your business is, whether you're business to business or business to consumer, you're ultimately communicating with people. And so as long as you get their sense of humor and can be creative in a way that resonates with them, I think that it's not something you need to balance. It's something you definitely need to do. We try to look for inspiration from what is popular with those groups outside of our industry and tie to those types of themes or topics. And I think it also makes sense to keep it tied to your brand as the brand steward for Veracode. That's something that's top of mind for me. So understanding what your brand personality is and keep in mind what you will and will not do, but then give the content team free rein to be a little bit creative with the way they're going to communicate.
Yeah, nothing else really to add there except that, B2B doesn't have to mean boring. We've seen some of our best campaigns that are going to traditionally, conservative audiences, in the finance industry that we feel like wouldn't respond well to a sort of a funny or a lighthearted approach, but I've found that those have been oftentimes the best performing campaigns for those clients. So definitely encourage you to experiment there, and your audiences will tell you whether or not they go for it.
Great. Let's take one more. This one's from Mark. Can you share any tips for producing interactive content best practices?
Yeah, I know Steve has a lot to say on this, but one tip that I would give is don't think of interactive content as something you need to create. Think of the content you need to create and what is the right form factor. And a lot of times that will be interactive. And then the only other tip I have, which I think is really important, is involve your web teams early. We made the mistake of not involving them in the process of creating interactive content, and we came up with this really great piece that Content for Demand created for us, and then we handed it over to the web team, and they had no idea what to do with it or how to get it posted. And it delayed the launch a couple of days because they had to fit it into their schedule. Had we involved them earlier through this DevOps process that we now have, they could have given us their requirements much earlier, and we could have given them what they needed to get that posted right away.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent lesson learned. And the one thing I would add to that is really just make sure, interactive content is strong. We've shown some good examples of that, but make sure that you're not making interactive content just for interactivity's sake. Anytime you're adding in an interactive layer or producing an interactive piece of content, you want to keep in mind what you want to get out of it, whether it's those buyer signals or even just an extra layer of engagement. Make sure you know what you're going to do with anything that you're going to make interactive and what you're going to take action on.
Great. Well, I think that's all for the questions today. Let's move it right along. Thank you so much for those great examples and insights. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind our audience that registration for the B2B Marketing Exchange, also known as B2BMX, is now open. In addition, we are also accepting Killer Content Award nominations. So buyer-focused content, like what we discussed today, is just one of the 19 available categories that you could submit a nomination for. Winners will be announced and honored at BWMX in Scottsdale, Arizona, which will take place February 19th through the 21st, 2018 at the Fairmont Scottsdale Princess, which is gorgeous. Feel free to submit your own content or campaigns or simply join us for some ideas and inspiration. Once again, all of today's live VII 17 attendees have also been entered to win a free ticket to BWMX. So be sure to follow our @DG_report Twitter account where we'll be announcing today's winner. For more strategic tips, tricks, and best practices, please be sure to join us again in the fall for our strategy and planning webinar series beginning on October 30th. As year-end approaches and you prepare to review annual performance metrics and plan for 2018, the Strategy and Planning webinar series will include expert advice to help you determine and successfully achieve your goals for the year ahead. I thank Vericode's Jessica Lavery and Content for Demand Steve Voice once again for a great session, and thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time to join us today and throughout the rest of the Buyer Insights and Intelligence series this week. A reminder that today's webinar will be available on demand, so you can access it at any time and share it with your peers and colleagues. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great weekend.